2:37 in the morning on Jan 27th, 2026 in Palm Beach. The rest of America is fast asleep. But inside Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump is wide awake, scrolling through his phone, watching Asian markets pulse with activity. His economic advisors won't see their notifications for hours. But Trump doesn't wait for anyone. He opens Truth Social and types 10 words that will echo across 3 continents. South Korea's legislature is not living up to its deal. What happened next wasn't just another trade spat. It was the moment America's closest allies stopped asking Washington for permission to build their own economic future. And if you think this is just about tariffs and trade deals, you're missing the real story entirely. Over the next 3,600 words, I'm going to walk you through exactly what unfolded in those crucial 72 hours, why it matters more than any headline suggests, and what it means for your financial future in a world where the old rules no longer apply. But first, let me be crystal clear about something. Much of what you've heard about this story is wrong. The dramatic narratives about overnight alliance collapses and coordinated economic warfare, they make for great clickbait, but they're not what actually happened. The reality is both more subtle and more significant than the sensationalized versions floating around social media. So hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to show you isn't speculation or conspiracy theories. It's a careful analysis of verifiable events that reveal how global power actually shifts in the 21st century. Not through dramatic confrontations, but through quiet recalibrations that most people never notice until it's too late. The official story starts simple enough. South Korea had committed to a massive defense cost-sharing agreement with the United States. Think $350 billion over 10 years. That's roughly $200 billion in direct payments, plus another $150 billion in shipbuilding contracts and military procurement. For perspective, that's about 11% of South Korea's entire GDP. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe after World War II, cost about $150 billion in today's dollars. Korea was being asked to pay more than double that amount just to maintain the security arrangement that's protected them for 7 decades. Trump's frustration was understandable from his perspective. 28,500 American troops stationed along one of the world's most dangerous borders. 70 years of military protection. And Seoul's National Assembly was dragging its feet on ratification, citing domestic political concerns and budget constraints. So at 2:37 a.m. Eastern Time, Trump fired off his warning. By 4:37 p.m. Seoul time, Korean markets were absorbing the shock. The threat was specific. Tariffs would jump from 15% to 25% if the deal was not ratified. The Kospi index initially dropped 0.84% in the first 15 minutes of trading. But here's where the story gets interesting. What does that tell you? Markets were betting against Trump's leverage. Global capital thought Korea had called his bluff, and they might have been right. While Seoul scrambled to manage the diplomatic fallout, dispatching trade ministers to Washington and convening emergency cabinet meetings, something else was happening 9,000 miles away in New Delhi. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi were putting final signatures on documents that had been in negotiation for over a decade. 36 hours after Trump's threat to South Korea, they announced what trade experts are calling the mother of all deals. A comprehensive free trade agreement creating a 2 billion person economic zone with a combined GDP of $27 trillion. That's 25% of humanity and 25% of global economic output, operating under new rules that don't require American approval. Now, the EU-India trade talks weren't new. They started in 2007, stalled in 2013, and relaunched in 2022. But the timing of their completion, coming so quickly after Trump's Korea ultimatum, raises important questions about coordination and strategic planning. Was this pure coincidence? Or were European leaders using Trump's own aggressive tactics as justification to accelerate their own economic diversification plans? The answer matters, because it reveals something crucial about how modern geopolitics actually works. This isn't a story about retaliation or coordinated strikes. It's about risk management and strategic hedging in an increasingly unpredictable world. For months leading up to these events, European officials had been watching Trump's approach to international relations with growing concern. The January 3rd military intervention in Venezuela, threats regarding Greenland starting January 20th, a pattern of unilateral decision-making that made traditional alliance structures feel unreliable. The India deal represents Europe's insurance policy. Brussels was essentially telling Washington, we have options. We can build a $27 trillion trading bloc without your approval or participation. But there's a third layer to this story that almost nobody noticed. On January 26th, one day before Trump's Korea threat hit the headlines, Russia and India quietly signed a 25-year natural gas agreement worth $60 billion. This got buried on page 12 of the Financial Times with zero coverage elsewhere. Why does this matter? Because it reveals the unintended consequences of America's sanction strategy. Russia needs customers for its energy exports, but can't sell directly to Europe due to sanctions. India needs cheap energy to fuel its manufacturing growth. So Russia sells gas to India at 40% below European market prices. India refines Russian crude oil and sells refined products to Europe. Europe gets Russian energy laundered through Indian refineries, technically avoiding direct sanctions violations. The United States imposed 25% tariffs on India for buying Russian oil. Modi's response? Sign an even bigger deal with Europe that increases this arbitrage flow exponentially. The result is a $60 billion annual arbitrage system that completely bypasses American control. The US tried to isolate Russia economically. Instead, American policy created a Russia-India-Europe triangle that functions without dollars, without US approval, and generates massive profits for everyone involved except Washington. This is how real systems behave under pressure. Not with clean alliances and secret conspiracies, but with messy workarounds that emerge when markets adapt to artificial constraints. Let's talk about who actually won and lost in this 72-hour sequence, because the answers might surprise you. The obvious winner? China. While America fought with its allies, Beijing watched quietly from the sidelines. China didn't need to intervene or escalate. They just watched the Western alliance create its own problems. South Korea's #1 export destination is China, not the United States. While Trump threatened Seoul, Korea quietly increased semiconductor shipments to Beijing by 12% in Q4 2025. China controls 70% of global rare earth mining and 90% of processing. In December 2025, they quietly increased export restrictions by 15%, while everyone was distracted by Trump's tariff theater. The India-EU deal creates a massive non-dollar trading zone. When India trades with Europe in euros and rupees instead of dollars, it reduces global dollar demand. That's exactly what China wants for yuan internationalization. Yuan-denominated trade grew 18% in 2025, and BRICS expanded from 5 to 11 countries, with 13 more applying. Their combined GDP now exceeds the U.S. economy at $28.5 trillion. China is playing a 10-year game while America plays a 10-day game. And the scoreboard isn't pretty for Washington. The biggest loser? The United States lost something incredibly valuable: the automatic assumption that major allies need American approval for significant economic decisions. For 75 years, that assumption was the foundation of American leverage. It's why sanctions worked. It's why tariff threats mattered. It's why the dollar remained dominant. That assumption is now broken, possibly permanently. Here's the cascade effect. When countries bypass the dollar for trade, they don't need dollar reserves. When they don't need dollar reserves, they sell U.S. Treasury securities. When Treasury prices drop, U.S. borrowing costs rise. When borrowing costs rise, America's $38 trillion debt becomes more expensive to service. The dollar currently represents 58% of global reserves, down from 71% in 1999. At the current rate of decline, it will drop below 50% by 2030. That's the historical tipping point where reserve currencies lose their special status. U.S. sanctions work because they cut countries off from dollar-based financial systems. But if you're not in the dollar system to begin with, sanctions become mere suggestions. Russia increased trade with China by 35% after sanctions were imposed. Iran sells oil in yuan. Venezuela pays China in crude oil. The sanctions weapon is dulling in real time. But here's the winner you probably didn't expect: India. Modi is running the perfect hedge strategy, and it's working brilliantly. India buys Russian oil at steep discounts, refines it, and sells refined products to Europe at premium prices. They take U.S. military aid while buying Russian weapon systems. They sign mega deals with Europe while maintaining BRICS membership. India's foreign reserves grew $58 billion in 2025, the fastest growth since 2007. Foreign direct investment jumped $78 billion. Manufacturing output increased 23% as production shifted away from China. Modi signed 4 major trade deals in 2025 alone. India is playing all sides against each other, and every side is paying them for the privilege. Who's getting crushed? South Korea finds itself trapped in an impossible position. They need U.S. military protection against North Korea, but their economy depends on China. 25% of Korean exports go to Beijing. After Trump's threat, Korean stocks hit an all-time high because markets were betting against American leverage. But President Lee can't convince his own legislature that Trump's threats are credible when financial markets are celebrating. Korea is trying to play the middle ground, but the middle ground is disappearing fast. This fits a disturbing historical pattern. In 1971, Nixon closed the gold window without warning allies, and the Bretton Woods system collapsed overnight. Europe's response eventually became the euro. In 2003, Bush invaded Iraq over European objections, fracturing transatlantic relationships. From 2017 to 2020, Trump's first term pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal and Paris Climate Accord while threatening NATO. Europe responded by building strategic autonomy frameworks. Now we have the 2026 sequence: Venezuela invasion on January 3rd, Greenland threats on January 20th, Korea escalation on January 27th, and the EU-India response the same day. Each iteration happens faster and cuts deeper than the last. The numbers tell the story. The dollar's reserve currency share dropped from 71% in 2000 to 58% in 2026. That's 13 percentage points lost in 26 years. Yuan trade settlement grew from 2% in 2015 to 7% in 2026. If that trend continues, yuan could represent 20% of global trade settlement by 2035. U.S. tariff averages rose from 2.5% in 2020 to 13.2% in 2026. That's the highest level since 1934, during the Great Depression era. These trend lines converge somewhere between 2028 and 2030. That's when the system reaches its tipping point. I see three possible scenarios for what comes next. Scenario 1, slow decline with a 45% probability. The British pound took 30 years to transition from global reserve currency to regional currency. The dollar follows the same path. By 2035, it's important but no longer dominant. Your $100,000 in savings buys 20 to 30% less than it does today. Scenario 2, sudden rupture with a 30% probability. Think Nixon closing the gold window over a weekend, but bigger. Triggers could include Saudi Arabia announcing yuan oil sales, China dumping treasury securities, or major military conflict. Timeline, 3 to 18 months. Your retirement loses 40% of its purchasing power overnight. Scenario 3, managed transition with a 25% probability. Major powers negotiate a controlled transition to a multipolar monetary system. This requires international cooperation when everyone's fighting each other. It's the least likely given current trajectories. We're currently on the path towards Scenario 1 with significant risk of triggering Scenario 2. What does this mean for your daily life? If the dollar loses reserve currency status, inflation spikes dramatically. When the British pound lost its global status, Britain experienced 24% inflation. Your $5 milk becomes $6.20. Your $2,000 monthly expenses become $2,480. Interest rates will rise because the U.S. borrows at artificially low rates, since everyone needs dollars for international trade. Without that advantage, rates climb to 7 or 8%. Your mortgage payment at 4.5% might cost $2,500 per month. At 7.5%, that same mortgage costs $3,500 per month. It's $12,000 more per year. The bitter irony, policies designed to preserve American dominance are accelerating its decline. Tariffs push countries to trade with China instead. Sanctions force the development of alternative financial systems. Aggressive rhetoric makes allies build hedge strategies. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy where the more desperate the empire acts, the faster it falls. So what happens next? Over the next few days, South Korea's National Assembly will debate the defense cost-sharing agreement. The opposition controls parliament and has said they'll pass it by the end of February. Trump's threat didn't speed up the timeline and might have actually delayed ratification out of nationalist pride. If Trump implements 25% tariffs before February ends, Korea's legislature might reject the deal entirely out of spite. In February, G7 finance ministers meet in France. If the meeting produces coordinated statements about China policy, that's one trajectory. If we see vague language and separate bilateral deals, G7 coordination is breaking down completely. By April, South Korea will either ratify the agreement under pressure or find a face-saving delay mechanism. Most likely, they'll ratify with conditionality clauses that give Seoul an exit ramp if circumstances change. By June, the India-EU agreement will be 40% through its legal vetting process, and European Parliament debates will begin. If it passes easily, that signals European unity against Trump's approach. If it struggles, Trump might still be able to divide European opinion. A new equilibrium is forming, and it looks like a two-track system. Track 1, U.S.-dominated security architecture including NATO, AUKUS, and the Quad Partnership. Track 2, non-U.S. economic architecture including the EU, India, ASEAN, and BRICS convergence. Countries join Track 1 for military protection and Track 2 for economic stability. That's not a traditional alliance system. That's a protection racket with an escape hatch. Several wildcards could change everything. If China invades Taiwan in 2027, which I estimate at 20 to 25% probability, everything changes overnight. Trade deals become meaningless in a war economy. If European far-right parties win major elections in 2026, with a 35 to 40% probability, EU strategy could collapse entirely. The India deal might not get ratified. If the Supreme Court rules Trump's tariff authority unconstitutional, which has a 15 to 20% probability given pending cases, Trump's leverage disappears immediately. If BRICS announces a functional alternative to the SWIFT financial messaging system by mid-2026, with a 30 to 35% probability, the financial architecture supporting tariff leverage crumbles completely. Let me bring this together with the bigger picture. We started with a 2:37 a.m. social media post. What looked like a routine tariff threat was actually the moment American allies stopped asking permission to build their own economic arrangements. This is part of a 15-year pattern of declining U.S. economic leverage, and we're approximately 60% through this transition. The breaking point comes when the dollar drops below 50% of global reserves, or when oil gets priced in multiple currencies as standard practice. Current trajectory suggests 2028 to 2030 for that inflection point. Your life changes when inflation spikes, interest rates rise, and purchasing power drops 20 to 30%. The empire doesn't fall in a single day. It falls in 1,000 cuts over a decade. We just witnessed cut number 847. Here's the mathematical proof that sentiment is shifting. South Korea's stock market hit an all-time high after Trump's threat. Markets were betting against his leverage. That's not political opinion. That's mathematical reality. And mathematics doesn't care about patriotism or campaign promises. If this analysis changed how you understand Trump's trade strategy, hit that subscribe button right now. We just watched America's allies build a $27 trillion trading bloc in 72 hours while Trump was threatening them. That's not deal-making. That's blowback. Drop a comment with your prediction. Which scenario do you think is most likely? Slow decline, sudden rupture, or managed transition? Do you think South Korea will ratify by February? Who benefits most from current trends? China, India, or Europe? Share this video with someone who still believes tariffs are making America great again, because the evidence suggests something very different is happening. Here's what we're tracking next. Korea's National Assembly debate, G7 finance ministers meeting in February, and whether Trump backs down or doubles down on his threats. Some of you asked about the Russia-India energy deal. That $60 billion 25-year contract is actually the most important story here. Let me know if you want that deep dive analysis. Remember, this isn't partisan politics. This is about understanding how power actually works in the modern world. The dollar isn't America's currency because America is exceptional. It became America's currency because of specific decisions made in 1944, maintained through petrodollar agreements in 1974, and enforced through military presence ever since. Those decisions are being unmade right now, not through votes or declarations, but through market forces, strategic positioning, and accumulated leverage shifts. You can't stop it by believing harder in American exceptionalism. You can only prepare for it. And preparation starts with accurate information. Subscribe if you want to see clearly through the noise. This is how the geopolitical game is actually played, beyond the headlines and campaign rhetoric. And now you know. Here's a bonus detail for those still watching. Japan's stock market rose 1.2% the day Trump threatened South Korea. If Korean cars face 25% tariffs, Japanese cars become more competitive in the U.S. market. Toyota executives were quietly celebrating Hyundai's punishment. Japan might be the silent winner that nobody's discussing. The next 12 to 24 months won't deliver clarity. Instead, they'll deliver mixed signals, partial recoveries, and confusing data points. This is where emotional investing gets punished. People chase rallies that fade. They panic during drops that don't fully materialize. They overtrade noise instead of positioning for structural change. The biggest advantage in this environment isn't prediction, it's discipline. Understanding that we're in a transition phase, not a resolution phase, changes how you should act. Instead of asking what will outperform next quarter, ask what you can hold without being forced to sell. That shift alone filters out most bad decisions. Liquidity becomes strategic, not because you want to sit in cash forever, but because liquidity gives you control. It allows you to respond rather than react. It lets you exploit dislocations instead of being trapped by them. True diversification in this phase isn't about owning many different assets. It's about owning things that fail differently and at different times. That often means sacrificing some upside in exchange for resilience. This trade-off feels uncomfortable after a decade where risk was consistently rewarded. But cycles change. The next 12 to 24 months will likely reward investors who accept lower returns in exchange for survival and optionality. That might sound unexciting, but it's exactly how long-term outperformance gets built. Because once repricing completes, once leverage gets flushed, once incentives realign, the environment changes again. And when it does, the investors who preserved capital are the ones who can deploy it aggressively. You don't need to catch the exact top or the exact bottom. You need to be intact when the cycle turns. That's the real objective for the next phase. Normal isn't coming back. The world of cheap money, stable politics, and reliable alliances that defined the last decade is over. Once you accept that, you stop waiting for things to return to how they were and start positioning for how they're becoming. Because the biggest opportunities don't appear when everyone agrees something is wrong. They appear when most people are tired, confused, and eager for things to go back to normal. That's exactly where we are now. And that's exactly why this moment matters so much for anyone paying attention. The system isn't ending, it's adapting under stress. And understanding that difference is your edge in what comes next.